Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we look at the end of America's longest war in Afghanistan. 20 years ago, at the start of the conflict, Colonel Laurence Wilkerson was at the epicenter of decision-making as Chief of Staff to then US Secretary of State Colin Powell. Now, a distinguished professor at William and Mary College, what's his assessment of America's longest war? He joins Alex shortly, but first, to your tweets, messages and emails in response to our show last week on political polling, featuring Professor Sir John Curtis and James Kelly. Jim Scott says, love it. Opinion polls used in Dumfries doesn't stipulate what the rest of us in Scotland are thinking, and it's that simple. Monica McDonald says, this is a must-watch for all indie supporters. And in response to James Kelly's appearance, Terry says, great show. Good to see you on it, James. And finally, Sarah Alba says, it was nice to see you on TV, James. Let's have more. Now, Vietnam veteran Colonel Laurence Wilkerson prepared the UN presentation by which Colin Powell justified the invasion of Iraq to the international community. He now describes it as the worst moment of his professional life, as he moved from Washington insider to trenchant critic of the neocon policies of successive US administrations. He joins Alex at the close of the American intervention in Afghanistan.
Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Glad to be with you, really.
Now, this week, Colonel Wilkerson, the last American troops and NATO troops have left Afghanistan. But 20 years ago, you were right at the centre of decision-making. Was there any thought back in 2001 that this was a conflict or an engagement that might go on for 20 years?
I'm really glad you added NATO there. The United States has done its level best to pull NATO into out-of-area operations and therefore justify its continued existence, a subject on which I can wax. But to your question, I was there in the beginning. I was there when people like Colin Powell's lawyer, himself a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, William Howard Taft IV, a very famous name in American politics, objected to the war instrument, pointing out that we had used law enforcement as our principal counter-terrorist methodology for years. Only one exception, really, Ronald Reagan's raid on Libya in April of 1986, which didn't last very long. And there was a lot of sense to that. Realpolitik sense to using law enforcement, to continue to use it. The moment we selected the war instrument, we elevated al-Qaeda and its like to warrior status. We even had extraordinary difficulty coming up with a term to describe them so that Geneva Conventions and other things wouldn't apply to them. We lost, and we understandably lost, I think, because as President Bush himself told a group of evangelicals visiting the White House, my rage is up. Please help me restrain my rage. I think that was the most telling comment the then young, neophyte, inexperienced president made. It was all about revenge and secondarily about preventing a second attack. And we thought if we went after the head of the snake, we would prevent a second attack better. But it was an ill-informed decision to decide to use military power. We now are bathed in the Madisonian warning of when you give the executive unlimited war powers, you are on a dangerous track, a very dangerous track. And we're paying for it. And Afghanistan is just one of the debts we owe.
But your boss, because you were Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, himself a knowledgeable but cautious general, was he not advocating the war instrument, or was he saying, look, there might be other ways to bring Osama bin Laden to book?
We really wanted to explore as far as possible getting the Taliban, Mullah Omar and others in the council. We wanted to explore that to the ultimate, as we did want to explore inspectors back into Iraq later in 2002 and 3. And the administration completely blew that out of the water, even as Colin Powell got a 15-0 vote in the UN Security Council to reinforce that. Dick Cheney was running the government at that time with regard to national security and foreign policy. So yes, we had some objections once we knew and understood the political circumstances. Let's face it, the administration had no mandate, no political mandate. It had the mandate of the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a lot of fear in those opening days in the administration that the American people would throw us out for the mistake that we just made. Tremendous mistake that cost a lot of lives. So that trepidation lasted only a short time. As soon as Bush went to New York, stood on that pile and said, and those who did this will hear from us very soon, because that won the American people's following. He got 90% in the polls then. He realized how effective, Karl Rove, his political advisor, realized how effective that stance was, and that it could, as he said at the time, assure Bush of a second term in office if he just played the global war on terror correctly. I overheard Karl Rove in the Indian Treaty Room at the old Executive Office building, Eisenhower building now, say to his henchman, Ken Melman, if we exploit this right, we can be in power for a long time. And that was the political incentive. So war had to be the instrument, and Powell finally realized that. Plus, Dick Cheney told him, essentially putting his finger in his chest, you aren't the chairman anymore, so don't be advising on war. You advise on diplomacy, not war.
So, in other words, if you take other things that happened in the incoming administration, as it was, like the Chinese spy plane crisis of April 2001, where the view of Colin Powell and perhaps George Bush Sr. would be influential in this as an old China hand, of caution, of negotiation, of agreement prevailed. Was it 9/11 and the traumatic shock to America that put policy into the hands of Dick Cheney and the neocons, for a general description? Was the significant thing?
That's an excellent point. I've said a number of times that I think President Bush was on Colin's side with regard to the April 10th, 2001 collision of the EP-3 and the Chinese F-8 fighter plane, the crisis. He was on Powell's side because he understood the importance of China to Walmart. That's just a sort of general comment, simplistic as it is, but it says, hey, without China, we won't have a very good domestic economy. So Bush knew that, so he sided with Powell in that instance. Rumsfeld and Cheney wanted a war. At best, they wanted a Cold War. They wanted to open relations with Taiwan in a significant way and tried to do so. So you've got a good point. Later on, though, Powell has lost some of his ability to influence the president, not only because it's not China issue, it's something else, but also because Rove and Cheney were working on the president all along, surreptitiously as well as alone in the Oval Office, to ensure that he believed Powell was potentially the most powerful candidate in 2004 to contest his second term. And this was not something the president forgot. I've studied this with every president since World War II, and it is stunning to my students when they find out how domestic politics, and particularly the president's desire to be successful, influences fateful decision-making, where boys and girls die in conflict overseas. LBJ's decision in '65 to go the road in Vietnam and go to 500,000 troops is a good case in point. A lot of people don't believe domestic politics has that much impact on American presidential decision-making, but it does. It's often the most decisive factor. And with Bush, he was worried. He was worried about Powell.
But from your estimation, as a military man, as a veteran of Vietnam, as a helicopter pilot, I mean, would it have been possible to extract Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in particular from Afghanistan without the overthrow of the Taliban government?
Well, of course, we didn't do that. We got bin Laden many years later, and we didn't get him in Afghanistan. We got him in Pakistan, the godfather of the Taliban. The Taliban did not start in Kandahar, as common wisdom has it. They started in Quetta. They started as a tool of the ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence, the CIA of Pakistan, in order to keep Afghanistan roiled, unstable, so that Pakistan would have strategic depth against its principal enemy, India. It doesn't take a great strategist to figure that out and why they're doing that. I even had a conversation one time alongside Powell with President Musharraf about that very thing, which drew a smile from the general and the president. Pakistan's behind the Taliban. It's still behind the Taliban. One wonders where that's going to go, because it might be the thing that unseats the civilian government in Islamabad eventually, as this terrorist element begins to become more infectious in Pakistan itself. But it's a dangerous set of circumstances that we're leaving, and I'm of mixed mind about our leaving because of that. The geostrategist in me, which is what I trained as in the military, was educated as, says we shouldn't be leaving, regardless of the minimal costs we actually were paying for staying there. We shouldn't be leaving. And then the soldier in me, consulting many Marine and Army veterans, tells me, yes, we should, because they say, don't stay. It's a miserable failure. It's a failure that has many causes, most prominently that Afghanistan is not a state. It's a group of tribes. It has artificial borders. Many of its citizens, so to speak, live in Baluchistan or in Pakistan proper or in northern Iran or is in Uzbekistan and don't see a border. So it was an impossible mission from the start, but it shouldn't have been a state building mission. It should have been a mission of national security.
A question I want to ask you, if America hadn't diverted the war on terror into Iraq, could Afghanistan have been a success, or was it always doomed to failure?
Excellent question. When I was serving Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I knew that we had told President H.W. Bush that we could not do two regional contingencies at the same time. And the reason for that was because we were cutting the military by 25%. The president knew that and was willing to buy that risk, didn't think there was that risk very tenable in the future. So we did it. And then along came Clinton and we cut another 3%. So by the time we get to the point where we're contemplating really seriously doing Iraq, and it was much sooner than the press indicated, Powell is again putting on his chairman's hat and saying, Mr. President, you can't do them both. You can't. And Cheney is again putting his finger in Powell's chest and telling him to get out of the military's business, because we had people like Colonel Magruder telling Newt Gingrich, telling Don Rumsfeld that 50,000 troops could do Iraq. And indeed, that's what Tommy Franks called Powell and told him he was having to deal with in terms of the war that was being contemplated. 50,000 troops would be all. Nonsense, in other words. But that was what we were dealing with. And at the end of the day, your question is answered by saying, yes, Afghanistan became an economy of force theater, meaning minimal troops. The Taliban were able to recover significantly, so significantly that the 100,000 plus up by President Obama did nothing to arrest them. And ultimately, though, you have to look at the task and the challenge. Even if you put 500,000 troops in Afghanistan and stayed there and rousted out everybody you possibly could, maybe even eliminated half of the population, you still would have the problem I indicated earlier. It is not a state. It is not a national entity. And it has partners, as it were, all around it that don't like the idea of a stable, functioning state. We're going to see now how much that has changed. I think it's changed with Iran. I think it's changed with Uzbekistan. I'm not sure about Pakistan. I think it's changed with Russia. I think it's never been that way, but got that way and now has changed with China. So the neighbors are going to determine the future of Afghanistan now, I think, plus the nature of this new, and I emphasize new, Taliban government.
Coming up after the break, Alex continues his discussions with Colonel Laurence Wilkerson. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Alex is discussing the end of the engagement in Afghanistan with Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, the former Chief of Staff to General Colin Powell.
Colonel Wilkerson, I'm now going to ask you a question which you're probably better placed than virtually anybody else on the planet to answer. Where in 2003 did the intelligence come from that suggested that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify the Iraq intervention?
Richard Bruce Cheney, Vice President of the United States, who orchestrated the Office of Special Plans through Rumsfeld and Douglas Feith in the Pentagon, and others whom George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence, coerced in France, Jordan, Germany, and other places. And when I say coerced, it's not that hard to do, because if you're sharing intelligence from such sophisticated national technical means as the US possesses with your allies, and they don't want to stop that sharing and make you angry enough to possibly curtail that sharing, they will go along with your worst lies. And that's what people did. Today, people talk to me about Dominique de Villepin in France and Chirac and their opposition. I can tell you that the French were right in there when Powell was preparing for his presentation at the UN. Those French that Tenet allowed in, saying that we were right, that there were aluminum tubes, for example, that indeed they had spun some in their own laboratories, and they spun them to 98,000 RPM without visible deterioration, clearly not rocket shielding or mortar shielding, clearly metal for centrifuges. So we had reinforcement from the Jordanians, from the Israelis, from the French, from the Germans, and so forth. We all know about curveball now. The Germans were at the end, the BND at the end was saying things like, well, maybe you shouldn't trust this guy. But Tenet was paying no attention to them. Tyler Drumheller, the European representative of the CIA, told me afterwards that he actually registered twice complaints about what Powell was going to say at the UN with John McLaughlin, Tenet's deputy, and with George Tenet himself. And it didn't wash. In fact, John essentially said to Tyler, the train's too far down the track now. So there was a combination of people who colluded, much the way they colluded for Ronald Reagan in the early 80s to report the Soviet Union as being 10 feet tall so that Ronald Reagan's arms buildup would be politically sound. They colluded to make sure that Saddam Hussein had WMD. That Powell and I did not see through that is my greatest lifetime professional fate.
And was it that growing realization that Colin Powell, the world had been sold a pup, as it were? Was that the reason that you left the administration and developed into a strong critic of neocon approach to world politics?
Actually, the motivation for me was torture. I knew that the United States military had tortured people in the Philippines. It had tortured people during the Indian Wars from 1865 to 1890. I knew it had tortured people in World War I and World War II. But I knew also that no president had ever officially authorized as a matter of policy torture. George W. Bush did. Under the pressure from Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, George W. Bush did. That's what really turned me off the administration and off U.S. policy and got me to be outspoken about that policy.
You've described the intervention in Afghanistan as being comparable to the great game of the 19th century, with the protagonists now effectively being the main protagonists, the United States and China. Is that a valid comparison? Do you think that's where we are now, that Afghanistan is still of that strategic significance between the two dominant world powers?
I think Central Asia is, and Afghanistan just happens to be central to Central Asia. If I were playing the grand strategist, I would say, forget state building, forget nation building. All those things are accoutrements of your presence there, and maybe you can do some things for women and education and so forth. But really, you're there for geopolitical and geostrategic reasons, and you just described them briefly. You're there because you're right next door to the potentially most unstable nuclear stockpile in the world, that of Pakistan's. You want military hard power to be able to seize that stockpile if necessary. You're there because you're cheek and jowl with the most well-funded Chinese-based road initiative, in case it turns out to be as antagonistic to our interests as some of the neoconservatives and others are saying it is. And you're there because you have a tiny little border with the largest province in China, bigger than France, Xinjiang province, where some 12 million Uyghurs live who don't like the Han Chinese. So if you want to cover CIA covert operations in China, the way we tried to do against Mao in 1950, 51, 52 and on, then you want to be in Afghanistan and you want to use those Uyghurs as part of your tools. There are all kinds of strategic reasons to stay in the great game, as it were, but we don't seem to understand strategy anymore.
So given that, and America, NATO are not there, what now for Afghanistan? What would be given that the decision to withdraw has been made, the withdrawal has been effected, what now for Afghanistan?
The best solution I can think of is that China and Iran, and I note that Iran's foreign minister, even this new group of hardline people in Tehran, are doing this or trying to do this. Turkey, Russia, others of note, even India, suddenly realized that it isn't good to have this instability in their midst and began to help whatever results in the Taliban government in Kabul to get its act together and to be more like a modern state and more like they would wish it to be in terms of stability, help it economically, financially, and so forth. I don't for a moment think they'll all in unity do that, but I think if Russia and China and maybe Pakistan holds off a bit, if that happens, then there's a chance that it could become more stable. That the United States might, as usual, after this geostrategic failure, have to reinsert itself at some time is clearly possible, particularly if some of the things I just described as reasons to stay suddenly become near existential. Nuclear weapons really bother me today. Arms control has just fallen apart. Other than New START, we don't really have any more in the world. And we have new nuclear powers like North Korea and, of course, Israel, which have never been in there. We need a massive effort amongst all of us in the West to bring arms control, nuclear arms control, back to the front burner and to do something about securing these nuclear weapons that are essentially like climate change, existential at the end of the day, only in a very shorter time period. I'm hearing generals today, flag officers in the United States military, talk like they talked in the 50s, the early 50s, that nuclear weapons do have utility now, that we can make them small and we can make them tactical and we can even shoot them off ballistic missile submarines, and that they are war instruments that are feasible. This is nonsense.
So how damaged is the president in the short term, or will his longer term decision be justified?
I think it depends almost completely on how he handles this very difficult and challenging domestic agenda he has. Karl von Clausewitz said something really smart, I think in book 8, beware the vividness, if I'm translating the German correctly, beware the vividness of transient events. Well, that's what the media lives on, of course. And Kabul is a transient event. It'll only become extremely important if some of the things I just talked about materialize. That transient event will be forgotten by the American people. Hell, substantive events are forgotten by the American people within 48 hours. And I'm looking at the polls now, and I'm looking at what particularly Democrats are saying, and I'm seeing 55, 60% ultimately, grudgingly in some cases, in favor of Biden's decision. Not happy about the way it was executed at the end, but happy about the overall decision. So I don't think it's going to damage him. Failure in this domestic agenda arena will devastate him.
Iran, is there any possibility that there might be a change in American policy towards Iran, a country in the Middle East which actually has what could be described as genuine elections? Is there any prospect that there might be a rethink about Iran?
That's an excellent question, too. I've often said of late that there's a theocracy in Jerusalem that bothers me more than a theocracy in Tehran. I see a lot of realpolitik, a lot of real security, national security, regional security, international security, good thinking in Tehran. We would have had it, I think, and President Obama and I met in the Roosevelt Room to talk about this, along with John Kerry as Secretary of State in November 2015. we would have had a much better path towards a better solution, a rapprochement even with Iran, had we not left the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. That Trump did that, and that the thug Mike Pompeo was his instrument in doing that and continuing it and amplifying and making more profound the repercussions of that cancellation or that backing out of that treaty, may have made it almost impossible to get back into. So that's, your point is well taken, and it's a case I rue and regret every time I look at it, because they were our hegemon, our power for 26 years when the Shah was in charge. We recognized that this was the most powerful potentially and really geographically and so forth in the region. And now we just disregard that at our peril.
And Colonel Wilkerson, you're a military man, but now a distinguished professor. Your attitude, your brand of Republican politics, a liberal Republican with a world view, is there any hope for that tendency within the Republican Party? Is there going to be a revival of that sort of attitude, or is it lost and gone forever?
If it is revivable, it will take another decade probably, but there are people working. There are young people working. I've been all over the country, all 50 states. I've talked to some of them, 40 and under, and they're every walk of life. They're financial investment people, they're bankers, they're farmers out west who are sick and tired of Republicans, for example, in Boise, Idaho, polluting their water and ruining their rivers and so forth. And these fires have just added to that. Will they be able to cohere and bring about a new Republican Party? That, I think, is the domestic political question of the hour here. Because if not, we only have a single party system, and that's dangerous.
Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It started with a terrorist outrage. It ended with a terrorist outrage. Al-Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers. ISIS killed more than 180 in Kabul. After the expending of floods of blood and treasure, America and its allies have finally left Afghanistan. The chaotic and bloody nature of the departure should provoke much soul-searching. Let us hope that it looks deeper than the abrupt manner of leaving, but into the real rationale for staying there for these 20 long years. Colonel Wilkerson is of the view that the Great Game, which took Imperial Britain twice into Afghanistan in the 19th century, is still being played, with the only difference that America and China have replaced Britain and Russia as the main protagonists. If so, with over 200,000 dead, it has been a very expensive match. And so, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.